Dear friends and colleagues, we're going to begin our next session. It's a pleasure for me to serve as the coordinator for this session, and we have two speakers, as you can see. Ms. Azadeh Fathi, who is currently in the master's program at the University of Cologne, and her topic is the Ashura tradition, between tradition and functionalism, and she explores the role and the importance of Ashura celebrations in two or three different periods in contemporary modern Iranian history. The second presentation is by Ms. Anahita Hosseini, and her topic is even more complex. She's going to explore the relationship between a hegemonic role by the state, by the Iranian government on the one hand, and their various policies to soft pedal and to try to create a positive acceptance of their own positions. So the tensions between, on the one hand, the coercive policies of the government, and on the other hand, on the persuasive and consent-seeking policies of the Iranian government. So we will start with the Ashura discussion presentation by Ms. Azadeh Fathi.
Thank you, and thank you to Iran Academia for organizing this conference, and thank you for taking your time and being here today. The following presentation is a still ongoing work for my master thesis, which I have titled Ashura in Iran Between Tradition and Functionalization. And I want to share it with you at this stage, and I would appreciate your thoughts and comments for my further consideration. If we extract the battle that took place on this day from the context of human history and view it as an isolated event that happened somewhere, sometime, we fail to recognize the significance of Hussein's actions in history. The battle that Hussein began and brought to an end at the Euphrates River was neither the first battle in the history of humanity nor the last. Every day is Ashura, every part of the earth is Karbala, and every month, in every year, in every century is Muharram. This is how it is stated at the beginning of the speech by Ali Shariati, which he delivered on the occasion of Ashura in March 1972 at the Hosseiniya Ershad in Tehran. He goes on to explain that this is the wave of a river that will continue to flow through the history of humanity as long as tyranny persists. What happened on the 10th of Muharram in the year 61, October the 10th, 680, in Karbala at the banks of the Euphrates, became that momentum that gave Shia Islam its identity-forming character. The battle and death of Hussein ibn Ali and his companions have since symbolized the uprising of good and justice against tyranny and oppression. Undoubtedly, it is the Battle of Karbala where the Shia finds their passion and which is crucial for the subsequent course of Shia history. As Kamran Scott Aghay describes in his book Martyrs of Karbala, for Shi'is this event has become the root metaphor upon which many of their religious beliefs and practices are based. It has served as a vindication of the Shi'i cause in the face of Sunni criticism, as well as constituting the central event in their understanding of human history. At the same time, the rituals associated with this battle have historically served as a vehicle for expressing and strengthening a variety of political and social relationships, associations, and identities. From this narrative, which was recorded throughout history not only by Shia, but also by Sunni historians like Muhammad ibn Jarir at-Tabari in the early 10th century, a symbolism was born. The impact and significance of which, in the context of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, will be one of the subjects of this presentation. After all, the aim here was also to rise up against a tyrant of the own time, who was seen personified in the Shah, the Yazid Zamane, the Yazid of those days, as Ayatollah Khomeini referred to him in his 1963 speech. The 1979 revolution in Iran certainly cannot be explained solely through the Shia religious movement. It was primarily an Iranian revolution, involving people from various ethnicities and religious denominations, as well as different political ideologies, from leftist, communist, Marxist groups to liberals and nationalists. Even among the religious revolutionaries, there were diverse perspectives. It should also be noted that not every Iranian Shia automatically supported the revolution. As Nikki Keddy explains in her essay, Change in Islam, Islam in Change, Islam does not always mean the same thing to the followers. When examining the individual elements that led to a dynamic change in the perception of the Battle of Karbala, it becomes clear that in the years and months leading up to the revolution, the significance of the reinterpreted Shia principles and their symbolism was able to resonate even with non-Shia and entirely non-religious revolutionaries. These reinterpretations represented an ideology with which they could identify their ideals. The poet and journalist Khosrow Gol-Sorkhi, for example, who was put on trial by the Shah's secret police due to his communist activities, mentioned in his defense speech that, as a Marxist-Leninist, he had encountered social justice through Islam, which eventually led him to socialism. The life of Mullah Hussein, he explains, serves as a model for our lives today. After this introduction, now a few words about the general space and the Ashura rituals as they were observed during the Pahlavi era, and then I will move on to the 1960s and 1970s, which culminated in the revolution and the establishment of an Islamic Republic. This new regime claimed the Muharram rituals for its legitimacy and ideological reinforcement. The first Pahlavi ruler, Reza Khan, was rather hostile towards traditional rituals as they did not convey the image of a progressive, secular nation-state that he wished to present to the West. Interestingly, however, I quote from Aghai, he was a participant in Muharram rituals in the early years of his career, but became more and more hostile to these rituals as his position became stronger until he finally banned most of the public rituals entirely. His son and successor, Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, was not as consistent in his stance. While he maintained the ban on the more extreme rituals, such as Ramazani, the self-flagellation, most other ceremonies were allowed to be publicly performed, and articles and reports about Hussein and Karbala could be published in newspapers. Aghai describes, he also portrayed himself as a good Muslim leader and sponsored Muharram rituals in the tradition of previous Iranian dynastic rulers. He incorporated a diverse set of strategies to legitimize his rule. He claimed that his government was a democratic Islamic monarchy in the tradition of the ancient Persian kings. At the same time, he tried to encourage only the politically pacifist interpretation of the symbols and rituals of Karbala. By the 1960s and 1970s, Aghai continues, who relied far less upon strategies for religious legitimacy. He put less and less time and money into religious rituals and activities and promoted secular nationalist ideals more aggressively. Eventually, a crisis of legitimacy resulted. Ore claims that one of the factors contributing to this crisis of legitimacy was the Shah's failure to make effective use of Muharram symbols and rituals. It should not be overlooked that the parallels drawn between the heroic figure of Imam Hussein, the events of Karbala, and the circumstances of the 1960s and 1970s, and the person of the Shah were not a novelty unique to this period in Iran. For example, as early as the late 19th century, during the tobacco protests, Nasiruddin Shah was declared an instance of tyrannical counterpower, and political demonstrations were aligned with the Ashura ritual, with protesters donning burial shrouds to signify their willingness to die. Through the experience of colonial intervention and the accompanying humiliations, a new analogy was established. Similar phenomena were also observed during the Constitutional Revolution. And this is precisely the point where the potential of Ashura for transformation lies. Through the ages, as a tradition of mourning and penance, it can establish a direct connection to the present reality of the believers and thereby initiate a movement against the status quo. It represents a rejection of a tradition and, above all, the underlying ideology that is no longer compatible with one's own reality, even contradicts it, and a shift towards an alternative that feels fulfilling because it addresses the questions and problems of the time. But this transformation into a serious force within the collective, capable of countering the dangers of imperialism, colonialism, and Gharbzadegi with toxification, could not occur without a critical reinterpretation of Shia history and religious principles. The significance of combining criticism of tradition with social critique was perhaps most profoundly recognized by Ali Shariati during this period. Often referred to as the ideologue of the 1979 revolution, with Ervand Abrahamian, for instance, calling him the main ideologue of the Iranian Revolution, and Hamid Dabashi dubbing him the Islamic ideologue par excellence. His significance lies primarily in his substantial contribution to reinterpreting Shia religion and history within the religious discourse of his time, and bringing them into a critical dialogue with the social and political challenges of his time. The phrase, "every day is Ashura, every place is Karbala," which was quoted at the beginning and he attributed to Jafar as-Sadiq, the sixth Imam of the Shia, emerged during the revolution as a slogan, an inscription on banners in the bazaar. Shariati represented the counter-component to the revolutionary clerics, against whom he consistently took a clear stance, explicitly speaking of an Islam minhay ruhaniyat, an Islam without the mediation of the clergy. Not only for this reason was he a thorn in the side of Murtaza Motahari, who was also very active in the Husseiniya Irshad. The cleric, who was very close to the future revolutionary leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, focused primarily on Karbala and the figure of Hussein in his lectures, which were later published under the title Hamoseh Hussein, the Epic of Hussein, and placed great importance on religious sermons and lectures, I quote, to inform the public about political issues. They would have their roots in the tragedy of Karbala and constitute one of the most important pillars of society and religion. Hamid Dabashi in turn refers to him as the ideologue of the revolution. I would like to use the remaining few minutes to draw a connection to the present day and contemporary Iran. What is the significance of Ashura now, after it was politically functionalized with its symbolic power for a revolution and effectively utilized with the concepts of jihad and martyrdom to mobilize the masses in a country whose state system has established its power with this ideology and has enforced it as the prevailing order? Has it really? After the controversial presidential elections in 2009 and the emergence of the Green Movement, religious symbols and slogans were revisited by the protesters against the political establishment, which claimed the religion for itself. In this context, the events reached their new culmination point in Ashura 2009 in December, also referred to as Bloody Ashura, and the theocratic system was confronted with the question of legitimacy. In her latest book titled Iran Without Islam, which references Shariat's call for an Islam without clergy, Katayoun Amirpour interprets the protest following the death of the young woman Jina Mahsa Amini as an uprising against the theocratic state that is not inherently anti-Islamic. It is anti-Islamic in the sense that it rejects the version of Islam imposed by the rulers of the Islamic Republic. Following Asif Bayat's perspective, Amirpour describes this phenomenon as a post-Islamic movement. When we inquire about the significance of religious rituals like Ashura and, by extension, the role of Islam in today's Iran, we are primarily confronted with the problem of a lack of, or at least insufficient, empirical research. Unfortunately, studies and analyses on the topic of Ashura in Iran, such as those conducted by anthropologists and religious scholars like Mary Higland, Michael Fisher, and Hans Kippenberg, before and during the revolution, are missing for the period after the establishment of the Islamic Republic. The reason is obvious. The domestic political situation and various restrictions make it difficult to conduct comprehensive and reliable independent field research. In surveys, concerns for personal safety, for a lack of trust, or a lack of trust in the research institution might prevent participants from expressing their true opinions. It is challenging, but apparently not impossible. The results of a nationwide state survey titled National Survey, Values and Attitudes of Iranians, conducted in the fall of 2023, show a clear shift of the Iranian population away from the government's ideology and a marked inclination towards a secular system. The majority of participants supported the separation of religion and politics and emphasized that they were not willing to take action against women without a hijab. The survey was classified as confidential and has not been made available to the public, which has led to significant criticism. However, it is also understandable given the stark contrast between the survey's findings and the official stance. In this context, it is also worth mentioning the well-known survey conducted by the Gaman Research Institute on Iran's attitudes towards religion, which was carried out from abroad in 2020. Of the approximately 50,000 participants, 90% of whom lived in Iran, 22% identified as non-religious. According to Gaman, the results can be generalized to the target population with a 95% probability. In conclusion, I would like to say that despite the significant restrictions and controls imposed by the regime, research and analysis in this area are still being pursued, including studies on the role and evolution of Ashura rituals in recent decades. These efforts should be viewed within the context of a discourse that, particularly from a sociological and anthropological perspective, addresses the topic of religion and religiosity in today's Iran, originating from within Iran itself. For instance, the anthropologist Jabbar Rahmani, in his book Changes in Muharram Mourning Ceremonies, has explored the developments of these ceremonies since the 1979 revolution, focusing especially on the new forms of mourning and their sociological backgrounds. In one of our conversations, he pointed out that a considerable number of master's and doctoral theses have addressed the rituals and ceremonies of Muharram. And if you'll allow me this personal remark, the view from within, at the heart of the events, captures those circumstances whose connections are either not visible or only faintly discernible from the outside. It is through the bond of mutually respected dialogical exchange that a clear picture emerges. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Anahita Hosseini. As I mentioned, she focuses on this tension between the repressive policies of the Iranian state on the one side and the persuasive, milder policies on the other. Please.
Thank you very much. So as you can see, the title of my presentation is Politics of Hegemony in Post-Revolutionary Iran, the Complexities of Coercion and Consent. In this presentation, it's based on a segment of my PhD thesis, my ongoing, almost about to end PhD thesis. And the focus of my dissertation is the questions of power, ruling, hegemony, and particularly cultural hegemony in post-revolutionary Iran. The question itself, I think, as we could all agree, is a simple one, but attempting to answer it is where the complexities basically show themselves. So in this short presentation, I have decided to focus on one particular aspect of politics of hegemony in post-revolutionary Iran, and that is the question of legitimizing coercion by the state and othering political. And the particular case I will look at is basically representing and othering political dissidents in the years following the 2009 movement in Iran. Due to the nature of the conference, which is the Area Studies Conference, I've decided to make the presentation a bit less theory-heavy and focus more on, my empirical findings. I'm in the Department of International Relations, so if there are any aspects of the theory I'm discussing that you find interesting, please do feel free to comment on later on in the presentation. Okay, so this is the overall question that I asked in my thesis, but today I am going to focus, as I said, on the question of legitimizing coercion. I use a Gramscian framework, essentially. I do use complementary theories. I'll mention a few of these for different chapters, but essentially I use Gramsci. One might ask, you're analyzing contemporary Iran, why some dead Marxist guy from 8 years ago? And I would say, I think theory, if you find the right theory that you can connect to, that you believe is, applicable to a certain case, it can be applied over and over and it can travel. That's an effort-based term. So it is very natural for theory to travel. However, when it travels, we have to be conscious that we cannot just apply it crudely. We have to understand that this theory has been developed for different spatio-temporal contexts, and when it travels, we have to represent, as Said says, and re-institutionalize it. In addition to that, I also draw on Ravi Shilian. He talks about decolonial knowledge production, and when I engage with Gramsci, my engagement is critical. And I mention this because if later on during the presentation you hear that I use certain Gramscian terms slightly differently, it's because I recontextualize, and the third one, reimagining, I do to the best of my ability. As I said, I'm not going to really go deep into the Gramscian theory, but I'm just going to give you a few basic stuff that will help people who are from another discipline to be able to follow the presentation a bit better. So the question of ruling is at the core of Gramscian theory. And ruling consists of two moments. This is a simple way of putting it, but it's just a 20-minute presentation. Ruling consists of coercion and consent. And to explain this, Gramsci uses this very interesting metaphor. He uses a metaphor that he borrows from Machiavelli. So he says that if you are familiar with this mythological creature, the centaur, it's a mythological figure that if you've read Greek classics or if you watch Harry Potter, you'll be familiar with. It's a creature that is half man and half beast. So here we have a picture of the centaur, and the man represents rationality or, basically ruling through consent, and the beast represents domination and coercion. I've also given you a bit more of an updated version of that from the Dragon. So, it could be half woman, half beast. It doesn't have to be half man, half beast. So that's ruling. Ruling is a combination of coercion and consent. Hegemonic ruling, on the other hand, and again, this is one of the most debated concepts in social and political theory. If I just want to talk, I can just have a couple of presentations on how hegemony is understood in different ways. So rather than claiming I am the only one who understood what Gramsci really means, which is like what hundreds of articles about Gramsci are about, I think it's better to just say in which sense a person particularly uses hegemony. And from my perspective and the way I use hegemony is that hegemonic rule is a rule where there is a combination of coercion and consent, but consent is at the forefront. So as you can see, there are some extra explanations there. I'm going to read a Gramsci quote here. He said, two things are absolutely necessary for the life of the state: arms and religion, force and consent, coercion and persuasion, state and church, political society and civil society, politics and morals, law and freedom, order and discipline, violence and fraud. So as you can see, it's a complex explanation. However, if we want to bear it down to the basics, it is essentially coercion and consent. I'm going to very briefly talk about how the most simple forms of coercion and consent, or you can say persuasion and repression, violence and persuasion. The most basic forms of it, the most vivid forms of it, they are easy to see, easy to find instances of moments within society. However, and I just want to clarify this, we are only talking about societal consent, we are not other forms of consent. However, if you look at it in more depth, and Gramsci himself does this. This is not like my part, something new. Gramsci says consent comes in passive and active format. The active format is easy to see. People go to vote. People go to a mass demonstration to support the state. Active consent. But the passive consent is more complex, and others use the terms like adaptive consent. I particularly, in the case of Iran, have used the term ritualistic consent, etc. It's very complicated. Coercion is the same. The most visible types of coercion: executions, torture, repression, whatever the repressive apparatus of the state does, is more visible. However, symbolic violence, etc., are less visible. There's a dialectical relation between the two, and here is where the main bit of this presentation related to Iran starts. So there's a dialectical relationship between force and consent. As in, force needs to be justified and legitimized through politics of consent. So even the most repressive of regimes, which the Islamic Republic certainly is one. I'm not here to normalize the Islamic Republic and say it's not a repressive regime. However, even the most repressive regimes, they need to justify the force that they use. Because at the very least, in that way, they need to use less of it, or that it comes across as, more natural to people. And the existence of consent does not negate the use of force, and the use of force often is more effective and less consequential for states when accompanied by consent, even if the consent resides in another segment of society and not where the coercion has been deployed. So now let's move on to the empirical part of the work. I am going to walk you through what the Iranian regime does when it faces a crisis of hegemony. And it faces those crises quite often in the past decade and a half. I'm going to use one particular example. In my work, I go way beyond state elite discourse when I explain the Islamic Republic's attempts for overcoming crisis of hegemony. I look at state elite discourse, but I also look at how they do this in the cultural sphere, through school textbooks, through movies, through organic intellectuals who are active in the social media, etc. Here today I'm going to focus on movies. Let's see what happened after 2009 and how the Islamic Republic tried to justify its coercive measures towards Iranian dissidents and basically represent them in a way that would justify its coercive measures. So in 2009, fortunately, it's the Iranian Studies Conference, so you all know what happened in 2009. What is significant is that for 2 decades, the Islamic Republic had some sort of a discursive silence. And people, I have the name of the authors here, Elizabeth Mills and other people talk about discursive silence in detail in other contexts. Discursive silence is basically, in the Iranian case, the state for 2 decades after the 80s, after it had managed to win the civil wars, after the 1988 massacre happened, after the Iraq war finished, for 2 decades the state didn't really discuss the dissidents in depth. They basically decided to deploy this discursive silence, which you would see in school textbooks, in movies, etc., where they would rarely discuss what happened to these dissidents in the 80s, particularly. They would not really discuss it. They were not interested. You can see in school textbooks, because you can see the changes very easily every year, it is very visible that for 2 decades they wrote very minimally about who the dissidents in the 80s were and why they were suppressed. When 2009 happened, the state suddenly faced a situation where it had killed hundreds of or dozens of or hundreds of protesters, had imprisoned people, tortured people, and they had to justify what they had done. So they started producing movies. And they produced 2 particular movies. These are the pictures of the posters of these movies, the Golden Colors and the Dissertation. They deployed what I call their core discourse. The dissidents were portrayed as, pro-Western, modern, and their security service agents who were against these dissidents were portrayed as, good Muslims and, very religious men, etc. These products failed. They failed massively. People attacked the actors' cars. The actors wouldn't find jobs even amongst the organic intellect. Even amongst, the organic cultural figures of the Islamic Republic who produced movies, etc. So both movies were a massive fail. I could talk a lot about this. It's actually very interesting, but I'm going to skip. So let's just have this in mind. The movies failed. So what the state does after this is basically, it starts some sort of a discursive division, meaning that it kept what I call, and this is where I differ from Gramsci's slide, I use the term core discourse rather than use a traditional ideology, etc. They separate their core discourse from their organic discourse. Their core discourse remains. So if you open a TV channel in Iran, you will see a documentary that justifies that Nigar Shah-Karami in the Women's Life Freedom Movement committed suicide. She wasn't killed. But that is basically aimed at their own core supporters because they want to keep them, intact, basically. But what they did is that they further developed, and I don't have time to go through this, the organic discourse was there, but they further developed what I call an organic discourse. This I take directly from Gramsci, which means that they were trying to also produce movies, cultural products that appealed to the average person, not to the state supporter, to the, your average everyday person who doesn't like a job, who drinks a beer after, at a party, etc. So, and this is where it gets very interesting. What they did for this was they stopped producing movies about the events that had just happened. They didn't produce any more movies about 2009 because the memory was too fresh. They couldn't tell you who had been in the streets and seen what had happened, no, this is not what happened, our version is correct. And this is what I call a temporal distortion. They started something that I think is a process of temporal distortion. They instead referred back to the 80s. They started portraying dissidents in the 80s instead of focusing on dissidents right now, right here, right now. And there are no movies on women's life freedom. There are no movies on the 2018 uprisings, nothing. So after these 2 years, they kind of learned their lessons. They kept making the state-produced small documentaries for their core supporters, but nothing for the masses. So one of the things they did was they didn't just go back to the 80s, and that is Hazar Siksad Shah, 1980s in the Western calendar, the Christian calendar. They did not only represent dissidents, they also reimagined the past of the 1980s. If you know the Iranian history, the 1980s is the pinnacle of the Islamic Republic's suppression. They have done mass murders, executions, tortures, beyond belief. But what they do is they start this kind of nostalgia genre of the 1980s. They romanticize forced hijab as some sort of a bad fashion. Just like, the Western 80s. And this is a movie poster from, one of those movies. They produce a lot of these movies which reimagines the Iranian 1980s. And essentially, I'm just trying to find my slide. They reimagine the Iranian 1980s. And one of the things that these nostalgia, I call it the nostalgia genre, this nostalgia genre does is that it distorts people's memories. After they started nostalgia genre of the 80s, they weren't, suppressive. They were funny and people were wearing stupid clothing and whatever. They started making movies about dissidents. Now, what happened here was very interesting because they focused on one particular group of dissidents, namely the MEK, the Mujahideen. So what happens here is that because their internal hegemony, that religious-oriented, and slightly also you've written about that nationalist religious discourse, is not giving them all that they want. Therefore, they start drawing on internationally dominant discourses. So the attempt to overcome the crisis of cultural hegemony heavily relies on drawing on internationally dominant discourses and internationally constructed hegemonic imaginaries. Why do they do this? Because they believe that there's a certain segment of the Iranian society that if they think some idea comes from the West, it's more legitimate. And there's a truth to that. Here I use the theory of uneven and combined development. I'm not going to get into it here, but it's basically the question of that the internal and the international always have a connection. You can never find a modern society, at least, that there is only one element at work, that discourses, ideologies are only internal and the external always work together. I'm going to go a bit quickly through this because I realized I've got 3 or 4 minutes left. So what they draw from the international discourses is, first of all, they advance their narration building, etc. They create imperfect characters. So they make a movie about a group of security agents and MEK people having a clash. These are 2 of the most famous films in that genre, the Midday Event. And they draw upon classic Western movies. They basically portray the protagonists, the security forces, as imperfect people who get angry, make mistakes. And this is very new for the Islamic Republic. Prior to this, it was always the perfect, people who were religious, never smoked, never got angry, never disobeyed orders. And they, into romantic relationships in their life, they reinvent the security agent figure. And I think that was one of the selling points of these movies, because unlike these previous movies on the 2009 movement, these movies did not fail. People in the diaspora criticized them, but people in Iran went and watched them. And when they started representing the other, they represented the other looking like a Hollywood film. So their people they were representing as dissidents were Islamists. Therefore, they never portrayed leftists or feminists or liberals. They only portrayed MEK, people who had potentially joined ISIS and Jundullah. So the terrorists that the Islamic Republic represented in their movies was very similar to the terrorists you would see in Western movies. And this is, if people know how the Islamic Republic's discourse worked in the 80s, that is in a very direct contrast, because in the 80s, they would represent their dissidents as kuffar, as infidels, as anti-revolutionaries, as the Engelab. So this is a very sharp contrast. And so that's one of the rhetorics they draw upon heavily, is the counter-terrorist rhetoric. And to a lesser extent, they also draw, and I find it surprising, they draw less on the separatist rhetoric. I personally thought they could have done more with that. They do it to a certain extent, but they do not really focus on the separatist rhetoric as much as you would have thought they would. And we can discuss that later as well. And there is also ideologic displacement. Can I have 2 or 3 extra minutes? Is that okay, Dr. Van?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, thank you. Ideologic displacement. So the ideologic displacement is a phrase I use, and I find it very interesting because they portray their opponents as extremely religious and their security forces as non-religious. This is very implicit, and I have to watch quite a few films to get this, but I find this one of the smarter ways that they try to reconstruct this. But of course, there's always a combination of internal and external. There's never only international, no internal. In the internal side of the thing, they have reconstructed the religio-patriarchal discourse of Gayrat and Namus. And this is also one of the interesting things they do, because in these movies, they basically criticize, again implicitly, that Namus in the private sphere, and instead redefine Namus in a national sense. And this is, I think, also one of the most dominant things in the last few years' movies that they make about security forces versus the dissidents. Okay, finally, they also normalize, and this is one of the more complex ways of normalizing coercion, is that they make a lot of films about qisas, and they put qisas, which is basically retaliation, execution. They put it in place it in the private sphere. It is a people versus people kind of discourse rather than the state versus people. And through this, they also normalize execution. And finally, I want to mention that, the reason that the Islamic Republic allocates all these resources to develop all these cultural products, etc., is because of what we can call intersocietal unevenness. There are different segments within the society, and the Islamic Republic basically produces different products to appeal to different stratum of the society. I'm going to wrap up here. It's almost 22 minutes. Thank you very much. And I hope that I have managed in this short time to kind of give you a more complex understanding of how the Islamic Republic works and go beyond that idea of repression is sinful. And this is obviously not the case of trying to normalize that state. It's a case of trying to understand that state. And from my perspective, I think producing knowledge and understanding how authoritarianism works is a sort of resistance in and of itself. Thank you.
I'd like to maybe begin by 2 comments, one on each of the 2 presentations, and then open it up for our discussion. On the first presentation by Ms. Fatih, a couple of observations on the question of martyrdom. First of all, some of the more recent research shows that the manner in which we portray what happened in 61 AD, what happened in Karbala, has been quite unreliable. The events, first of all, were not described by more than 2 individuals, right, at that time. So there was not any kind of reliable, testimonies as to what happened. So all of that is being questioned in some of the more recent research. Mr. Eshkevari, for example, recently wrote a piece which was quite interesting in that regard. And secondly, as I'm sure you're well aware, the exploitation of that myth during the Iran-Iraq war, where, as I'm sure you well know, tens of thousands of people were martyred. Families would deliver their children to be martyred, with a sense of pride. That's exploitation, And I think we need to point that out. And thirdly, don't forget that this whole notion of sacrifice and martyrdom and so on, it evolved into sacrificing others. That is what we call suicide terrorism. That included not just sacrificing yourself, but justifying the murder of often tens, if not hundreds of other people. So it seems to me that in talking about martyrdom, and in attempting to, if you will, de-romanticize our notions of martyrdom, along the lines that Shariati, for example, tried to do, we need to be more attentive to the exploitative practices of the Islamists in promoting martyrdom. So that's my comments on this. And I'm sure you're, again, aware of all these arguments, but I just wanted to put them on the table so that you could comment on them. So this is not a critique of what you said, but simply, trying to remind ourselves that there are other aspects of martyrdom that should be part of the discussion of this, heroic tradition. Now, a comment on Ms. Hosseini's presentation. You talked about the coercive practices of the regime, and then described the persuasive, aspects of it by using the films, the movies, as your examples, which was really, I thought, extremely interesting and informative. One other dimension of this, which is not in Gramsci, but you and I know very well, is the security dimension of it. So the regime is not only involved in coercive practices, beating the hell out of the demonstrators, killing and so on and so forth, or just in persuasive, but especially in the past few years, the regime has become more and more, in a very sophisticated way, using, by the way, the experience of the Russians. And the Russians have the best intelligence, capability and tradition and so on. Identifying, and this aspect of the regime's attempts to control the opposition is, from my point of view, as important as either the coercive or the persuasive aspect of it. So let's not, again, I'm sure you're aware of it, but I thought we should add this other dimension of the regime behavior, which is really an increasingly sophisticated system of trying to identify potential opposition, face recognition, all kinds of other things. And again, they have terrific advisors. Recently, last week, I think the head of the Russian intelligence paid a longish visit to Iran. So I thought I would just add those to your most informative. So we can now turn to some of the questions, and you can also respond to my comments when the time comes. So we have 1, 2, 3, yes, and 3, yes.
Thank you very much from both of you. That was very interesting themes. And Anahita, I am asking you, presented a very interesting theme with very interesting example of the Iranian produced movies. And I'm asking the films like Golden Colors, Dalladai Tala, or Majarani Nimruzin, obviously ideological themes. You used in the day, you used more and more day produced. These days as soldiers of culture from Islamic Republic. Can you generalize that to somebody like someone Muqaddam that produced Nahang Ambar, which is the direction of comedy? I can understand that in a sense is that also ideological. But I want to know, because you know that in the reform time was somehow two front between fundamentalists and the reformists, and the production was somehow different. But you used they in all this period. I want to know that. And also there, I have no question. I want to say for somebody that is interested in continuing such an interesting theme, I will represent at 12 o'clock the role of the Muslim engineers in the foundation of the Islamic Republic, that which is relevant to the theoretical that you spoke about it. And if somebody interesting, it is in Persian, but I'm advertising. That was. Sorry, half 6.
Yes. Please go ahead.
Yes, my question would address Ms. Hosseini about Gramscian theory, and because if you want to use Gramscian's theory, you have to somehow believe in collectivism, that there is this collective identity, and the government is targeting that, and it's trying to manipulate that. So what would be the response of the people? Is it in a collective form that they have to gather together, and what is the place of individual?
Would you like to?
Yes, I have a question for Bob, and I want to start with you. Just the question is about the symbols around Ashura during the 80s. They created these symbols, they used the old tradition for creating something new, or they just emphasize an older tradition to just remark something they believe. They wanted just to create a new tradition using something older. And about you, the question is, what do you think are the effect of these new strategies, of the Iranian government? What I mean is, they have an effect to maintain the constant in Iran and distinguishing between the cities like Tehran, that of course is different from the countryside or the small towns in Iran?
Thank you. Please, would you like to go?
Thank you very much for your comments, Dr. Banu Azizi, and all your questions. So yes, the question of security, that's I think very important, and I think also links back. It's not something I particularly work on because there's only so much you can do with a PhD. I've learned that the hard way. But even, in Gramsci, and obviously I was giving a short presentation, and he draws on Machiavelli again. They don't only talk about coercion and consent. That's the simplistic form. Like even Machiavelli talks about the lion, the man, and the fox. And Gramsci says, coercion, consent, and fraud. So there's, I think, always room, as I said, with recontextualizing to say, this theory was developed for that time. And now we're observing the Islamic Republic. Another aspect of it is potentially security. And I think that's very fascinating. And I hope to learn more about it someday. Thank you for that comment. Shall I continue or shall we go back and forth?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you. About the films like Golden Color, etc., thank you. That was a good question. I didn't have time to say. Yes, I do differentiate between. So one of the things I did to make my job easy is that there is this company, which you certainly know, others might. It's called the Company of Oj. It belongs to the IRGC. So any product like the midday event, etc., this company is directly owned by the IRGC. It was the early years. I think they made a mistake by announcing it belongs to them. Now they don't do that anymore. But that makes your job easy because I'm like, this film is produced by the IRGC. This is official state rhetoric. When it comes to people like Salman Muqaddam and the others who make that 80s nostalgia genre, yes, there is a difference. I agree with that. But that's also, I think, the brilliance of organic discourse. Good ideology should be invisible ideology. So I'm not saying that they sat in some dark room and decided together you go and do this. No, they do it because it sells, people like it. Okay? But also it is reproducing that state discourse, and together with those very directly ideologically oriented products, it makes a whole that is serving a certain purpose. So I don't know, maybe some of those people are not really, they don't really want to contribute to this. Maybe they are. The more movies I see, because like if you have watched, I don't know if you watched Fossil, it's recent. And in Fossil, there's a scene where they're normalizing torture as in presenting it in a comic way. Like can you believe that torture can be funny? Haha. And to me, these instances, because they also make a lot of things that are usually taboo within the Islamic Republic, like sexual jokes. That's one of the reasons why people like these films. They make a lot of almost explicit these days, sexual jokes in them. And I think there's some kind of maybe, and this is not something I'll put in my research because I can't sustain it, it's just an intuition, that, maybe there is some sort of you put this scene in your film where torture is funny and go ahead and make 5-10 jokes that people will come and buy the ticket. So I think it's actually what you pointed out shows that how complicated the process is. Thank you for the question. All right, the next question about Gramscian collectivism. Yes, absolutely. Wherever even when I talked about those first two films, Payamname and Qalladahaya Tala, they were rejected by people. So people resist against them, even collectively. The thing is that in this PhD, I focused on the state. I made that decision to focus on the state. Even though I come from an activist background, I know activism, I would have loved to write about activism, but I thought there's a gap here. And I have to see what the state does rather than what people do. But of course, as an observer, as an Iranian who follows Iran, I see resistance everywhere. And I think that's very, very important. And these products, the reason, when I talked about the question of namus, the reason they have to, in the film Midday Event number 2, the second, the sequel, the beginning scene is a scene that one of the IRGC members is helping a woman run away from her suppressive husband. And it's kind of reframing the question of namus, etc. And the reason for this is because they understand that people are not going to basically fall for this if they just present their very ideologic product. Thank you. That's, I think,
to go after you.
Absolutely, yes, and I'll then come back. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I will surely consider this in my work. About your question, you asked if there were used the old symbols in the ongoing of the revolution. I wanna give you an example. It were the old symbols and the old rituals and the old ceremony, but they were reinterpreted in another way. For example, Hussein was now a model, a role model, who you shouldn't just mourn for. He was a model for be a revolutionary, to stand up against the tyranny of the time. That's what happened. The symbols were taken, the rituals were taken, and it wasn't about passive mourning anymore. It was getting in action. Yeah.
I think, and this is not really part of my research, so I'm just saying based on what I have observed. But I think a lot of these products are in the places that they are so marginalized, like Kurdistan, Baluchistan, etc. I don't think they can really use these products that successfully as they would, amongst middle classes of Tehran, etc. That is kind of my observation, maybe based on social media. I can't really sustain it. But I think because the memory of the 80s in Kurdistan is much fresher and it's still being repeated in different formats. So obviously it would be harder for them to convince people. And there would be other mechanisms in place there, which I think would be worth investigating. But thank you for the question. Important.
Well, I just want to thank our two speakers and bring our session to an end.
Thank you very much.